Thank you, Jackson. So the current level of attention to and interest in tourism in the Arctic is unprecedented and only continuing to grow. From what I've been able to tell, this is the third major conversation over the last 2 weeks about Arctic tourism. 2 weeks ago, as President Grimson mentioned at lunch, there was the International Arctic Forum in St. Petersburg, where President Putin talked about the new Russian Arctic National Park and the need to address environmental tourism. The fourth conversation will be in 2 weeks in China at the Arctic Circle Forum, and part of that forum will address ecotourism and tourism in the Arctic. Another development over the last 2 weeks, just kind of exhibiting how much interest and activity there is in this area. In Norway, there's a tour operator that just announced its first 3 dates for Arctic cruise expeditions off of Norway. So there's a lot of interest there and a lot of attention to this issue. And with interest and attention comes opportunity, and tourism holds significant promise for the future economic development of our communities, regions, and nations. At the same time, there are clearly challenges and risks. By virtue of the location, the remoteness, the limited infrastructure, there are access issues, certainly. There are safety issues that need to be dealt with. There are questions about impacts on local communities, native communities, and then impacts on natural resources. And then there's, of course, the broader question. I mean, it's not just tourism that we're talking about in the Arctic. You're talking about energy development, mineral development, subsistence, shipping and transportation. So lots of different uses to consider, sometimes competing, sometimes compatible, and depending on how you do it, but there are important conversations to be had about this. So our objective with this session today is to share some perspectives and thinking about the present and future of tourism in the Arctic. We have 6 very distinguished panelists, each who have a wealth of experience and come at this from a different angle, I think. And so I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. I encourage you all to text questions to the number that will be up there later, and look forward to that. And so with that, I'll introduce all our panelists at once, and then they'll each speak for about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll take some Q&A. So our first panelist is Captain Dan Blanchard, the owner and CEO of Uncruise Adventures. Dan has spent his life around boats in the Pacific Northwest, first in Washington, where he grew up, and now for many years in Alaska. He now lives in Juneau and helms Uncruise Adventures, which is a small boat expedition company that's focused on providing enriching adventure travel experiences and on helping its guests gain an appreciation of local cultures in the natural world. They operate in Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, and much less Arctic-ish areas like Costa Rica, the Galapagos, and Mexico. So Dan's very passionate about what he does, and from what I understand, he's living the dream. So thanks, Dan, for being on the panel. Our next panelist is Captain Ed Page. Ed is the executive director of the Marine Exchange of Alaska, which is a nonprofit organization established to bring the Alaska maritime community together and to assist that community in complying with federal and state safety, security, environmental regulations, enhancing marine safety and environmental protection, aiding in emergency response and life-saving. Ed has a wealth of experience and expertise in the challenges associated with maritime activity in Arctic waters. I founded the Marine Exchange in 2001 after a 29-year career in the U.S. Coast Guard, where he served in many different capacities, including as a deck officer, serving assignments in Alaska in marine safety, environmental protection, search and rescue, and then ultimately as Chief of Marine Safety and Environmental Protection for the 17th District, the Alaska region. So next, and they've switched things up on me, but is Rebecca Lunga. Did I get it? Yeah, yes. The Swedish relatives help. So Rebecca is the first secretary to the Greenland representation in Washington, D.C., where she has served as an imported Arctic voice since 2017. Prior to her posting in Washington, D.C., She was head of section for Greenland's trade policy and responsible for coordinating Greenland's participation in international program cooperation, serving as Greenland's representative to the Northern Periphery and Arctic Program. In addition, in 2016, she was appointed as Denmark's head of delegation to the Arctic Council Sustainable Development Working Group, where she was responsible for advocating Greenland's interests in the Council and had an overall coordinating role within the Denmark to secure sustainable development in the Arctic. Next to Rebecca is Hugh Short. Hugh is the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of PT Capital. PT Capital is Alaska's first private equity firm focused on investing in enterprises in the Arctic, in Pacific Northwest, Finland, and Iceland, where PT Capital is one of the largest foreign investors. In founding PT Capital, Hugh and others saw the economic opportunity in these areas and recognized that they were underserved by the private equity community. They focus on travel and tourism and industries in terms of areas. And as Hugh pointed out to me at lunch, President Grimson mentioned that Russia covers 7 time zones. PT Capital's investment portfolio covers 11. So go Hugh, go PT Capital. So prior to co-founding PT Capital, among other things, Hugh is president and CEO of Arctic Slope Regional Corporations, Alaska Growth Capital Business and Industrial Development Corporation subsidiary, and served as the mayor of Bethel, Alaska. Hugh's a shareholder in 4 Alaska Native corporations and has heritage as a Inupiaq Eskimo. Next, I think a man who needs no introduction, but I don't get many opportunities to introduce a former president, so I'm going to do this quickly. But President Ulfur Ragnar Grimsson, again, the 5th president of Iceland, having served 5 terms between 1996 and 2016. Some of this was mentioned at lunch, but prior to that, he served as the Minister of Finance, a Member of Parliament, and I don't think this came up at lunch, but he was actually the first PhD in political science in Iceland and the first professor of political science in Iceland. So in addition to that, currently serves as the chairman of the Arctic Circle. He's been, as we all saw at lunch today, he's been a leading voice on climate, the Arctic, and clean energy, and very happy to have you on this panel. And then last but not least is Scott Haberstad, Director of Sales and Community Marketing for Alaska Airlines. Scott is a lifelong Alaskan, currently residing in Anchorage. He joined Alaska Airlines in 2001 after spending some time flying in Ketchikan, and then as Director of Marketing for the Visitors Bureau in Ketchikan. He's been very active in the community, serving leadership roles with the Resource Development Council of Alaska, the Alaska Travel Industry Association, and Providence Foundation Alaska, among other things. So thank you all for being on the panel, and look forward to hearing from you all. So with that.
John, thanks for the great introduction. I think I've never been described as distinguished, so I'll just leave it at that. My company, Uncruise Adventures, just real briefly, we are a small ship operator. Our home is in Alaska. We have 8 ships, of which 6 operate in Alaska. I'm happy to say that in 2021, we're venturing north to Prince William Sound. 2022, we hope to be out on the Alaska Peninsula and perhaps into the Aleutians. And we have some nebulous but good potential to operate in 2023 in western Alaska and the Aleutians as well, all the way up to the far north. We love adventure. We love travel. We love what Alaska has to offer from a cultural, scenic, and education point of view. And so do most visitors that come to Alaska. Now, what do we have going for us in the Arctic of Alaska? We have a lot. All the ingredients are there. We have a travel market that is desperate for wild places, that's desperate for something different. The bigger the big ships have gotten, the bigger the resorts have been around the world, the more intimate people, or the more people are looking for intimate experiences in wild, untouched areas. That is awesome. That is in our favor. They want active, experiential, and adventure travel kind of wrapped into one. And it's like I say, as the bigger venues get bigger, it's perfect for the Arctic because this tends to be smaller groups, and they spend a lot more money. That smaller group works well because of not only our airlift that Scott talks about later. You'll give us all the details on the latest flights, right? But it also adds to the perception of it being a unique place. I think the Arctic in Alaska has definitely the perception of being a very wild, a very nature-ridden in a way. That sounds negative, but it's good because our people in our world miss that so much in our cities in the lower 48 and throughout the continent. But this all comes with challenges. I know for us as a small ship company, particularly under a U.S. flag, we have a lot of different challenges that may not be allowing us to fully express our ability to move forward in the Arctic. Now, some of these challenges are with us as a company. Some rely more with perception, federal regulation, and such. Talking about perception, I really enjoyed our Lieutenant Governor's talk here today, just a few moments ago, about the resource extraction in Alaska, and that has a valuable place, but it also can be a very negative thing in the eyes of tourism. We have to be very careful when we thread this, that we thread resource extraction and the impact upon the visitors in a very appropriate manner. We believe that Alaska is going to be tarnished heavily by the world-renowned knowledge of the pebble mine activity. In my mind, and in the mind of many of those that sit on this side of the counter with me in tourism, that will be detrimental to the brand of Alaska. Yet there are other wonderful resource projects that can take place that will not affect the traveler or the brand that is Alaska. For a U.S. small ship company, one of the biggest hurdles we have, and the Arctic is riddled with this challenge, what do we do with the Jones Act? What do we do with the requirement that we have U.S.-built vessels? Now, the part of it that is U.S. crewed vessels is very easy, and I support that 100%. In fact, one of our foreign flag vessels is all staffed by U.S. residents. However, the cost of U.S. shipbuilding is ridiculous. It's out of bounds. It's about double the cost of the same ship being built overseas. So how do we handle this in the Arctic in terms of response? How do we handle that of a thriving Nome-to-Nome itinerary, for instance, that would bring a few hundred people every weekend through Nome and not require a foreign port call? This can be achieved through long-term financing, making it easier for companies like mine to purchase vessels, which really is just a tune-up of the MARAD Title 11 loan program. The other thing that we believe it needs to be improved, and I was so glad to hear this earlier, was the search and rescue capabilities in the Arctic. Right now, during the summer months, it is just impractical for us to put a small vessel of a couple hundred feet far north. In my mind, even though my insurers oddly don't disagree, but in my mind, we need to be able to have a quicker emergency response. And that's we lag as a country in the United States and in Alaska, of course, on that particular subject. Something we need to improve on a lot. So with that, I'm exactly 5 minutes. Unbelievable. Thank you very much. Let's chat more.
Next time I'm going to go before you. This isn't going to work for me. All right. Ed Page, Marine Exchange of Alaska. My slide just went off. Did I do something funny? Where'd that slide go? Is there a doctor in the house? The slides were up until Dan went down. Thanks, Dan.
You're gonna have to wing it.
Yeah, well. Showtime. Is everybody back there technical? Working slide thing?
There we go. There we go.
All right, back up. I need my prop. Anyway, we're a nonprofit maritime organization down in Juneau, but my board of directors is a maritime community. And they're the ones who have been proactively looking at ways to ensure safe, efficient, environmentally sound maritime operations. And so I'm just going to talk about some of the tools we're doing. And when you look at tourism, I started my maritime career 50 years ago and went in the Coast Guard. I spent some 30 years in the Coast Guard. But To me, I always looked at the evolution of maritime safety, and it's getting better and better. We're using technology so we can do things we beforehand probably wouldn't want to do. And the safety record's higher and higher. And so we're looking at how we use this new technology to ensure that we can have safe, environmentally sound maritime operations, some remote areas, and we've done this in the Wild West and Aleutian Islands, and now there's a new maritime frontier in the Arctic. And I look at the blue economy and how dependent our economy is on maritime activity. Alaska wouldn't really survive. It wouldn't have the ability to ship things up to Alaska, to build the infrastructure so we can use our raw materials and sell them. But also, when you think of if you have an accident like the Exxon Valdez, tourism stops. People think the whole state's covered in oil. The pipeline shuts down, so we get oil from the money from the pipeline. And then fishing, nobody wants to buy our fish because they think it's covered in oil. So preventing maritime accidents has a big negative impact on our blue economy. So I'm just going to talk real briefly. The Marine Exchange is based on the model of exchanging maritime information was back in the 1800s. This is like in LA. We're beyond that, I might add. But the goal here, and this is a New York Times article, and it talks about more ships in the Arctic, fears of disaster rise. And they talked a little bit about my operations center that we have in Juneau, 24-hour operations center. But every once in a while I come up with something profound, once a year, not even that often. But at least I finish it saying we need to stop worrying about things going wrong. The last word on the article, Sunday Times, was we need to stop worrying about things going wrong. We need to focus on preventing things from going wrong. And that's what we're all about, preventing things from going wrong by using new technology. And the industry being proactive on these issues. They don't have to necessarily have the Coast Guard or others come up with these ideas. So a lot of things are done, industry-led solutions. So we're not using semaphore and megaphone like they did way back in the 1800s. We're going beyond that. And we have a vessel tracking system. We're looking at thousands of vessels out in the Aleutian Islands and elsewhere to identify, and we're monitoring that 24 hours a day, ensuring that when a vessel breaks down, we can detect through alarms, whatever, that we can act very quickly and respond to it. And this is a 24-hour operations center in Juneau that's staffed to identify high-risk events and then initiate a timely response to minimize the negative consequences. And this is a system that we built throughout Alaska, 130 sites. We also built weather stations and current sensors, so when vessels make approaches to ports or other areas, they have the best information available to avoid a high-risk event. And so it's all about brokering information, not by semaphore, not by signal flag or whatever, but monitoring vessels through technology and communicating with vessels using new technology. I think this is some of the systems we built around the state, 130 tracking stations. This is the maritime activity we see going in the Arctic right now. We can graphically show that pictorially with these graphs to show which types of vessels are going there. So it's starting to open for business, and the challenge is to make sure that we close the barn door before the horses gets out and do it right and try to avoid accidents. And we've done that already. Right now we're monitoring 1.5 million square miles in Juneau. We build and operate this system, 21 folks. So technology, squeezing technology to aid maritime safety would come down to. And it's all about having good information on ships, having time to do something about it. So if we know early on that we can do some time, we can fix the situation, address the situation before we're going to extremis, and then having capabilities know where they are. So obviously, ships are going to the Arctic. Crystal Serenity is an example of a vessel that made it across the top. Okay? And we're just involved in providing this information. So automatic identification system, which is required by International Maritime Organization, all vessels over a certain size, and U.S. regs, it's over 65 feet for commercial trade. Every 6 seconds is sending information out. We're bringing that information, sharing with the Coast Guard, sharing with the state of Alaska, sharing with owner-operators of vessels. Everyone gets access to the information. And this is just examples of some discussion about by IMO, if we're going to do operation in the Arctic, let's make sure that we have ship monitoring and tracking. Let's make mindful of the Arctic communities and be mindful of how the impacts on them and minimize those negative impacts. And then they have the classifications of what vessels can operate in the Arctic, this IMO. So there's lots of safety measures going into effect to ensure that when we do operate in the Arctic, it's done right. So it's not being overlooked, it's really being addressed. And these are different categories of vessels, what they're allowed to go in. But this is where they're trying to get cruise ships now can actually operate in ice safely. So that's where we're going with this. And there's other IMO requirements, but this is just an example. There's a lot of work being done to ensure things are done right, a Polar Operations Manual, and then we're dealing with the local communities, indigenous communities, so they know where vessels are through an app, so there's no surprises. The cruise ship is just going to pop up. They're going to well in advance, and they can minimize the consequence because we'll know where they are, know where the native communities are, we can avoid conflicts. So it's all about brokering information, and we're working with the Coast Guard as far as We're not going to do things like we've done in the lower 48, lighthouses and what have you, and buoys. We're using new technologies. We got transmitters can send information VIS to vessels, virtual buoys in ice, because you can't put a buoy in ice. We can send information real time to vessels on environmental sensitivities, weather, environmental information, what have you. So it's all different information brokering to ensure that when we do operate in the Arctic, in cruise ships or any other vessel, that we're doing it safely. We're taking advantage of technology to do that. So I'm over my time. I had technical difficulty for 22 seconds. That's true.
Hopefully I have a prop too. Hi, I'm Hugh Short. And there's my prop. Let me start out here real quick. My name's Hugh Short. I am the CEO for PT Capital. I spend half my time fundraising. I often tell the potential investor into PT Capital that I'm probably the first Inupiaq Eskimo with an Arctic-focused fund that's been in your office. And I've yet, and I've been all over the world to actually say, no, you're the second. So, needless to say, I am unique in the private equity world. PT Capital was founded in 2013 with the idea that Alaska at that point had not had an institutional grade private equity fund raised in Alaska nor built in Alaska. In addition to that, there had not been at that time an Arctic-focused private equity fund that was looking at returns, opportunities, and the growth in that market. Today, as Jonathan said, we cover from the Russian border in Alaska all the way to the Russian border in Finland. Our portfolio is 11 time zones. We've recently got a little smart and opened up an office in Helsinki because someone needs to sleep. And so we've got a base of operations in Anchorage, Alaska, Helsinki, Finland. Proud to say 6 years later today, we're sitting on about $360 million worth of assets with about 10 co-investment partners. Over the course of the last 3 years, proud to say that we're the largest foreign private markets investor into Iceland, two fairly large assets, a hotel operating company, and the best telecommunications company in Iceland, Nova. Is that right? We have over 1,000 employees in 2 continents, 3 countries, and we're currently invested into telecommunications, tourism, and industrial services. I'm specifically here today to talk about tourism and Arctic tourism. This is an area that about 1/3 of our existing fund is invested into tourism assets. And I think the first thing we look at is the macroeconomic trend is a space growing. If you look at the space for tourism in the Arctic, specifically Iceland, in 2010, about 350,000 tourists went to Iceland in that year. In 2018, that number approached 2.5 million. You saw 15% compounded average growth rates year over year in tourists to Iceland. In addition to that, in Alaska, we're seeing 15% growth in 2019, 2020, and 2021 in Neo post-Panamax cruise ship vessels going across the Gulf of Alaska into South Central Alaska. Huge amount of growth in that space. So the check there. The second is consumer preference. As Dan said, as others have said, today's tourist wants an experience that's away from the loud hustle and bustle. They like nature. Iceland is a great example. You have glaciers, geysers, waterfalls. You can go down into a volcano. Hopefully it doesn't turn on, or what do they do? Explode. It's a short trip. But you can do all sorts of creative, innovative things, soak in hot water. And the market is huge for places like this. And what we look at is over the course of the next 2 years, we're expecting global adventure tourism to grow by 46% by 2020. It's a huge number. So this is a trend that continues to grow. The third is stable and supportive governments. Finland has done an amazing job to encourage Asian tourism. There is 45 or more direct flights a week from Shanghai, Hong Kong, Beijing, Singapore, Tokyo, into Helsinki. There's a great route up to the Laplands, and we have made an investment into a hotel operating company to take advantage of that trend. It's substantial growth. The size of the Helsinki airport's doubling over the course of the next 3 years. So, this is all government support, and the government provides that entry point. Finally, knowledge and experience. We have great entrepreneurs, investors, and operators in tourism in these markets. Overlooked, often hungry for capital, often can't get attention from investors, and that's our job to recognize and invest into those types of companies. And then finally, climate change. Climate change has, I was in Iceland, I was in Reykjavik in January. Of our 11 hotels we had in Iceland, our average occupancy was over 90% in January. And you couldn't find a hotel room in the capital region 101 district. It's amazing the amount of access, and you saw these poor people bundled up, just kind of waddling around, but they love it. So let's do more of it. There's risks. There's obviously risks, and I've got a few headlines here. Probably on the good side, Game of Thrones. I'm a huge fan. My wife and I, who's in the back of the room, caught up, so no spoilers up here. But we had Game of Thrones, the whole cast, for 2.5 months at one of our properties in Iceland. The inbound Game of Thrones tourism, for even people who don't watch the show, substantial. On the flip side of that, we just had WOW Airlines go out of business. Provided about 20% of the tours to Iceland. So unfortunately for 2020, we anticipate a flat to negative year in Iceland. But the good news is over 29 airlines use Keflavik as an airport. And those gates that WOW had have already been sold, and we anticipate in 2020 that space to be taken up. So we think that the demand will still continue to be there. Then if you look at Alaska, the cruise, I mentioned that. I'm going to actually get booted off of here, so I'm going to keep going to the end. So what's the key to investment in the Arctic? You can't have all your eggs in one basket. You can't be 100% invested in tourism. You cannot be 100% invested into energy. You've got to have a balanced portfolio. Today, we have a balanced portfolio of about 1/3 into tourism assets in Alaska, in Iceland, and Finland. We have the largest independent oilfield service camp and catering company in Alaska, which has grown over the last 2 years, and that represents about 25% of the portfolio. Many times people think the Arctic, it's an energy fund. We only limit it to 20-25% because that's the volatility that people want. And then finally, telecommunications. It's a great space, and so we're very excited about the future investment opportunities. Thank you. Whew, that's a lot to do.
I feel like you've all been so fast, so I'll take a little longer. I'll do my best.
Scott's hoping so.
How do I operate this one? Just that one. All right. Well, thank you for having me, to Rachel and the Arctic Encounter Symposium team. This is my first year attending, so I'm very excited to be here, very honored. I know a few of you, met some last night as well, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rebecca Lunge. I am posted from our Foreign Affairs Department in Nuuk, posted to our representation office in Washington, D.C. for 3 years. I have 1 year left, and then I go back home. This is our team. This is the whole representation of Greenland, covering the U.S. and Canada. It's our head of representation, Inutak Holm-Olsen, who I'm sure you know. He's been here the past few years representing myself, and then we have an intern for 6 months from back home, a master's student that will come and help us cover, and hopefully we're trying to recruit new young people to enter the Foreign Service with us. I was one in 2011 in Brussels. A lot of my colleagues used to be interns, so it works. But we cover, I can just briefly say, we cover Arctic issues, but also all the areas that are home taken by the Greenlandic government, which is, to many's surprise, a lot. It's everything from trade to fisheries, mineral resources, science, research, education. All these are covered by the Greenland government. And therefore, we're working on collaborations with the US and Canada on that, and that is our main purpose in DC. So the government of Greenland is dedicated to diversifying the economy as part of the independence goal and securing Greenland for future generations. Tourism in Greenland is steadily growing, but there is a lot of untapped potential still. We're far behind our neighbors, as Iceland, who's done a tremendous job over the past decade. So developing our infrastructure is vital. That is where we are. Of course, other factors like market development, marketing strategies, strategic partnerships, etc., are all very important as well. But having so limited time, I'll focus on our recent developments within infrastructure and share that with you. So it's been a really interesting day already, and I feel like my brain is blown. So I want to engage you all a little bit, knowing that I'm sure you're all feeling like me, a little tired, maybe a little jet lagged. So if I can ask you by raise of hands, how many have traveled to Greenland? That's a good amount. So how many of you who have traveled to Greenland have spent less than one day getting to your final destination in Greenland? I was hoping for a hand or two, because then I could identify our Icelandic friends, because those are really the ones who have that advantage. So unless you're traveling from Copenhagen or from Iceland directly, you will spend a long time getting to Greenland. We only have flights connecting to Greenland from Iceland, and those are not every day, and they're seasonal depending on the route. Otherwise, you have to go all the way to Europe via Copenhagen first to get to Greenland. So let me share with you a little example of how a trip from Greenland can go. And this is just from Nuuk. If I were to travel from a settlement on the coast or a town further up north, you would have to add one domestic leg to that journey. So this, I found my old itinerary from going to my first Sustainable Development Working Group meeting during the US chairmanship. And I was so excited I got to go to the North Slope of Alaska. I'd never been. And it was, I was starting my new position as head of delegation for the Kingdom of Denmark. But my excitement was somehow a little diminished by pure exhaustion of spending 51 hours traveling there. And that was just because I was lucky, really, because had the dates been different, I would have to go to Copenhagen first, and that would have added 1 day of extra journey and thousands of miles. Similarly, our deputy minister once took this journey from his hometown, Qaqortoq in South Greenland, to St. John's in Newfoundland, Labrador. And he spent 8 times the distance there is from Qaqortoq to St. John's to get there. It took him multiple days. So as illustrated, traveling to and from Greenland is incredibly time-consuming and very expensive. So we need these infrastructural improvements. They're vital, not only to provide our communities with the travel they need, because as many of you know, no roads are connecting any towns in Greenland. So the means of travel is either by boat when the waters allow it, or by plane. So this brings us to November 15, 2018. Inatsisartut, which is the Parliament of Greenland, agreed to this package for airports. So that was passed in Parliament not that long ago. This means that the runways in Nuuk, our capital, and Ilulissat, which is the main tourist destination town, will be extended to 7,200 feet, which will allow for cross-Atlantic flights to fly directly to those two cities. As it is now, you go to Kangerlussuaq or you go to southern Greenland. Otherwise, you have to fly domestically to get there. Moreover, Qaqortoq, which I mentioned before in southern Greenland, will get an airport with a 4,900 feet runway, which will allow it to be a sort of regional hub for that region. So the new, longer, and better equipped runways will enable direct travel to and from abroad with more passengers at a higher frequency and at a lower cost. That means, for instance, that the trip I was mentioning before that our deputy minister took, maybe one day in the near future he can take that on a 2-hour trip, 900 mile, on a Q400 from Qaqortoq. Just to briefly mention that funding has been secured. Government of Greenland has entered an agreement with the Danish government on assisting in financing these projects. There has been a company established for this purpose called Galactic Airports, and the government of Greenland will own 2/3 of that, and the Danish government will own 1/3 of that. There's been a tendering, a pre-approval for a tendering process on constructing these airports, and all 6 companies that have been pre-approved will be able to submit their bids before the deadline, which is very soon. It's May 15. And the decision on which of the companies will be awarded the contract will be made this summer. So construction will begin this year. Hopefully by 2023, we'll have some of those extended runways. Furthermore, in September 2018, the Department of Defense, the US one, expressed interest in strategically investing in projects related to the airport infrastructure in Greenland in a statement of intent. We're in dialogue with Pentagon surrounding what that could look like. So in sum, infrastructure is the single most important key to tourism growth, and the current airport updates will provide us with vital increased accessibility. This is not just in terms of tourism, also business development for Greenland or other areas where we can collaborate with the outside world where we've been very isolated. We're seeing that, we're hoping that these airports will kind of connect us more. We're so closely connected in many ways, and geographically we're part of the North American continent, but we have to travel so far to see each other. So that will change very soon. I think I'll end on that note. Thank you for listening. Koina.
I had the privilege at lunch to talk a little bit about my vision of Arctic tourism. So maybe I will try to stick within the 5-minute time scale. There are a few important fundamental premises that we have to be aware of. The first is that 20 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, nobody would have created a session on Arctic tourism. Because most people believed at that time Arctic tourism was not possible. Those who went to the Arctic were either nerds, eccentric, or had to go because of some economic or strange reasons. I mean, we laugh at it today, but it was serious at that time. It was something we struggled with in Iceland. I mean, how do we get people to come to Iceland? The name itself, I mean, kept people away. Hugh just mentioned that his hotels in Iceland had 90% occupancy rate in January. I remember when I was a Minister of Finance, on last day of the year, there is a television discussion among party leaders. And the news of that day, 31st of December 1990, was that there were 4 foreigners who had got lost the day before between the Westman Islands and the mainland. And we were sitting there, the main political leaders of the country, talking, are these people crazy coming to Iceland in December and January? They should come in June, July, and August. And we were supposed to be the leaders of my country. So the first premise is Arctic tourism is a new phenomenon. And it's a global phenomenon. And the second premise is the demand is already there. The traditional thinking in tourism is how do you create the demand? We don't have that problem with regard to Arctic tourism. The demand is already there. And it's being fueled every day of the year by this instrument. Because free of charge, we in the Arctic have these multitude of individuals who take photos and send those pictures all over the world. So we have stopped in my country having PR campaigns about tourism to Iceland, because every day of the year there are thousands of pictures that go all over the world, showing the uniqueness of the Arctic landscape. Our challenge in Arctic tourism is how do we meet this demand? How do we structure the hotels, the airlines, the offers that when people come, that we want to show them? And the third premise that I want to emphasize from our own experience in Iceland, when we are planning what people do when they come to the Arctic, don't plan it on the basis of what we think is remarkable about the Arctic. Try to show them the things that they find remarkable. I mentioned the Northern Lights at lunchtime. And all of us who've grown up in the Arctic find it crazy that people are willing to spend thousands of dollars just in order to see for 10 minutes the Northern Lights. But people also find it a remarkable experience to be able to travel around and with an empty water bottle and take the water from the springs all over, the clean water. They've never experienced that before. They have never experienced standing alone in the wilderness and being able to observe a place that even doesn't have a name in my country, but they find it extraordinary. We make the most common mistake in Arctic tourism in wanting to show people what we find interesting. We have to show them what they find interesting. And now I give you a concrete example of this. Some decades ago, there was a delegation from the African Union that came to my country. And the Foreign Ministry wanted to show them great hospitality. So they took them on a tour to a neighboring geothermal town close to the capital. And for us in Iceland, the most remarkable thing in the greenhouses in Iceland at that time was a banana tree, which was in one of the greenhouses. So they put the delegation from the African Union on this bus, took them to Hveragerði to show them the banana tree. Because for us in Iceland, that was the most extraordinary thing, having a banana tree in Iceland. But if you are familiar with Africa, you know that banana trees are like potatoes, in our country. They are everywhere. And I often use that to illustrate the importance of looking at the Arctic from the eyes of the young people in Shanghai, Beijing, Tokyo, Jakarta, Paris, Berlin, London, even Seattle. And then my last fundamental premise is we have to do this small scale gradually. Not build big 5-star hotels different parts of the Arctic. Build a chain of small locations. Build small tours. If you look at the tourism success of Iceland, one of the main reasons is the multitude of small and medium-sized companies that are the pillars of the Icelandic growth. So think small, think in a diverse way, and also be open to extraordinary possibilities. If I had been here 10 years ago, I told you the biggest owner of hotel rooms in my country would be a guy from Alaska. Again, nobody would have believed that. But take a look at Hugh. He is the personalization, the demonstration of anything is possible in Arctic tourism. And now he's going to Finland to repeat the experience there. So as I said to Alaskan Airlines earlier today, we need to create a connection, a network of entrepreneurs and companies and others, airlines, hotels, other areas, who offer the opportunity to travel across the Arctic and stay in small and medium-sized hotels and have the opportunity to fly from Greenland to Canada to Alaska and back and even into Russia. It's up to us. The demand is already there. And if we want to have Arctic tourism growing, we better get our act together in a way that PT Capital from Alaska has demonstrated in my country. Thank you.
Well, we made the first step. We're co-chair partners with Icelandair now. One ticket, we can take you most anywhere. Even take you to Nome, go see Richard. He does one of the best tours I've ever taken in Nome. Saw muskox, picked blueberries, did it all. Thank you, sir. Just want to be like you, my friend. Scott Haberstad with Alaska Airlines. I'm going to take a little different perspective here, but first I'm happy to say that there is a session after this session, so I'm not the last speaker before the cocktail party. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to look at, what we're looking like this summer in the state of Alaska with respect to the cruise industry and the air industry, and then close it out a little bit of the economic impact to Alaska based on the tourism industry. So this year, it's going to be an amazing year with respect to capacity to Alaska from the cruise industry. Dan touched on it. His tours take you to the areas of the state where the bigger cruise ships don't take you. The big guys take you to the Ketchikans of the world, the Junos of the world, the Skagways of the world, plus through to Whittier and Seward. We've got new players coming to Alaska that we've never had before. Viking Cruise Lines will be bringing their ocean-going ships to Alaska this year. We've got Oceana coming back to Alaska this year. We have bigger ships coming to Alaska this year. Hugh mentioned it. We've got 4,100 passenger ships coming to Alaska this year. So they're retiring or moving out some of the older, smaller ships, bringing in new, bigger ships to Alaska, which is good for us with more capacity. There are more sailings. We're expecting a 16.5% growth in cruise capacity in the state of Alaska this year. And as a selfish guy that works for Alaska Airlines, what I really like is the cross-Gulf sailings. I like Dan's too, because Dan's, people get off and on in Juneau and Sitka and Ketchikan. I know, I bit my tongue there. They have to fly into Juneau, Ketchikan, and Sitka to get on the cruise ship with Dan to take their cruise. But the Gulf crossings are the ones that go to Seward and Whittier. Those people have to fly into Anchorage or fly into Fairbanks to take the cruise. So there's more people flying and more butts and seats, which is a good thing for me. This summer, we're expecting about 1.3 million cruise guests coming to Alaska. And so what does that mean? Well, the airlines chase the cruise lines when it comes to the state of Alaska. And so this is coming up on my 18th year working for Alaska Airlines, and I can say this summer we will have more air capacity coming to Alaska than we've ever had before. We've got new carriers entering the market, and that's good for consumers. They're bringing different types of products into the market. So we've got Allegiant that's going to start flying out of Bellingham to Anchorage a couple, 3 times a week. It's a different model than Alaska Airlines, but it meets some people's needs. It's adding more capacity to Alaska, and it's adding a new route, Bellingham to Anchorage. Feeds out of Canada, also feeds in from Allegiant's network elsewhere. We have carriers that have been around for a long time, like American, serving new destinations. American will be operating flights this summer from Phoenix to Anchorage, bringing more capacity to Alaska. There's a lot more capacity nonstop going into Fairbanks than we've seen in years. Both United and Alaska Airlines are adding more capacity. In fact, United's got more capacity out of Denver. Delta's bringing more capacity in out of Minneapolis nonstop to Fairbanks. And Alaska Airlines, I mean, on average, over the last couple of years, we've had about 17 flights a day between Seattle and Anchorage. This summer, we are going to run 21 flights a day to Seattle, Anchorage. And this is in bigger airplanes. I mean, we used to have the 737-400s that would have 144 passengers on them. We've retired all our 400s. We are now running all 8s and 9s in the long haul to Alaska, which means there's about 156 to 172 people, depending on the aircraft, whether it's an 8 or a 9. So not only do we have more frequency, we have more capacity on those airplanes. So more seats in the market than we've seen in years. So what does that mean? That's where I'm putting my state tourism hat on. 1 in 10 tourism jobs, or 1 in 10 jobs in Alaska is associated with the tourism industry, which is significant. Local municipalities across the state realize about $88.5 million in fees that go to fund local governments. The state of Alaska, thank you, Lieutenant Governor, strong supporter of tourism, appreciate that. The state of Alaska realized about $126 million to the general fund in the form of fees paid by the tourism industry. Overall, there's about $2.2 billion in visitor spending in the state of Alaska. That equates to about a $4.5 billion in economic activity in the state of Alaska. And the president spoke about it. Winter tourism in Alaska, we've actually started embracing winter tourism. Our friends in Fairbanks have done it a long time before we did it. Dan's Awakenings, bringing cruise ship customers to Alaska in April, which at one point in time you thought it was crazy, and maybe some still do today, but we're seeing more visitors on the shoulder season, we're seeing more visitors in the winter season, which means the visitor industry is growing. What's at risk? Well, I'm going to take the risk from a little different perspective here. What's at risk is all the other nations, all the other Arctic states for the state of Alaska. Everybody wants our business. Everybody wants what the state of Alaska has. So we have to, from an Alaskan, and I'm speaking from an Alaskan's perspective and where the risk is for Alaska, we have to promote Alaska as a visitor destination. Because while people want to come, all the other states and nations, including Maine, want visitors to come to their areas. So if we don't reinvest, if we don't promote the state as a visitor destination, other people will promote their areas and they will take our guests. And so that is one of the biggest risks we have. And the neat thing is our legislature, many moons ago, implemented a tax, a vehicle rental tax, with intent language that the monies were supposed to be used for tourism promotion. A couple administrations ago, we had $16 million that we were putting into the tourism promotion to draw people to Alaska. Last couple of years with state financial woes, we had some issues and we dropped down to $1 million of tourism marketing, which isn't enough to keep the lights on. This year, the administration recognizes the VRT, or the vehicle rental tax, and they've put $7.4 million in for tourism marketing, which is a great step towards marketing Alaska and continuing to build and grow what we have. And wow, I'm already 2 minutes over. So with that, I don't want to keep you away from the cocktail hour. So thank you. I'll be around later for questions and tomorrow as well.
All right. So Scott went on for so long that I'm being told we only have time for one question. But I'm going to ask it 3 different ways, and they didn't tell me how many people can answer it. So how do you ensure that tourism development is culturally appropriate and sustainable? What are some of the things that are being done to address potential impacts to natural resources and cultures and communities? And then kind of a related question, I think, is how do you ensure that Arctic communities benefit from tourism development? So Dan, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll start out. You really have almost 3 different groups of cruise ships. You have the really large cruise ships, you have the couple hundred, 300 passenger larger ships, and you have me that float around 80 to 100 for the most part. So all three of those categories require different things. For instance, we talk about, potential growth into the Arctic and how do we work with cultures that are there. That's a lot easier to do with a small group that's very close and listening than a large ship which needs a lot of infrastructure, a lot of things to do. There's work with NOAA putting in a pier eventually. Not too many communities can pull that off as far as a large ship goes. So it does depend on the size ship you're talking. When cruise ship's a little bit generic. I know that we have found, just like I really appreciated the gentleman that was on in a couple sessions ago about the importance of listening. And I think that as an Alaskan, we are very tuned into listening to the community, and whether it's a native community or whatever, they all have special needs, and I think that is the biggest thing in creating an environment that works for everybody.
Let's see if this works. Does it work? It does work. I'm going to build off what Dan said. I believe it's incumbent upon the community to decide what they want with relationship to tourism. I mean, there are some smaller communities that don't want large cruise ships, and that's totally fine. So the community needs to decide what they want in tourism and then build the infrastructure to support that and work with industry to make sure that they're meeting the needs of the community.
I'm not going to answer the question, but I'm going to put a plug in for Scott and with President Grimson here, which is, I think one of the success stories to Iceland has been the stopovers. So folks going from New York, Keflavik, Reykjavik, and then on to a destination like London or Paris. And the immense amount of year-round traffic that stopover provides to Iceland allows hotels like ours to then expand offerings and grow. And it then makes accessible in January that tourist who maybe wasn't going to go but decided to spend a few days. I would propose that Alaska Airlines has the opportunity from a competitive advantage standpoint to hold on to Alaska, to say, why don't you do West Coast Anchorage free stopover, Japan, South Korea, or China trips? You've got the international footprint existing today. It's a 6.5-hour flight from Anchorage to Tokyo. There's immense demand for that traffic, and then I think the amount of people that would take that flight from Los Angeles to Anchorage, spend 3 days in Anchorage in January or November, and then go on to Tokyo would be fairly substantial. And so I didn't answer the question, but I got cut off in my time up there. So that's for you, Scott. Take the mic away from me.
Drop the mic.
If I can just... Go. Hello. Yeah, if I can just follow up on that. There was a clear moment for me when I discovered the potential that you had just mentioned. It was probably almost 30 years ago. I was flying to New York, and there was a businessman sitting next to me, and I started talking to him, and it turned out that he had a company on Wall Street and offices in London and Frankfurt. So I asked him, why are you flying Iceland Air back to New York? And the answer opened a new world for me, because he said, I discovered a few years ago, I can take the evening flight out of Frankfurt or London and come to Iceland, or late afternoon, come to Iceland in the evening, have a good meal in a restaurant. The next morning, I hire a car. I drive for half an hour outside the city, and I'm in complete wilderness. And I walk alone for about 5 or 6 hours, and then I take the late afternoon flight back to New York, and I am a new man when I come to Wall Street the next day. It has saved my soul, he said. He was the first person that opened up for me this reality about what we now call the Arctic neighborhood. So we have to offer people these connections in terms of airlines, but we also have to, and this has not been mentioned before, and I know some people don't like to hear it. We have to offer tourism for the very wealthy and the very affluent. Not in the luxurious Four Seasons kind of style you get in cosmopolitan cities all over the world, but in terms of extraordinary experience in the wilderness and in nature, and not only for these people, but for their kids and for their grandchildren. So one of the interesting aspects of Icelandic tourism is this high-pay part of people who are even willing to stay in your hotels, although they're used to five-star hotels, I mean, in different parts of the world, because they are being offered this other experience. And if you look at the growing wealth of Asia and the growing affluence of the upper middle classes and professional classes of Asia, there are millions of people who are added to this category every year. Every year. And we only need 3% of that growth in order to have our hands full in terms of meeting these demands. So the real challenge is for us to realize, as I said before, that the demand is very different from what we had thought before. That's why what you said about Tokyo and Alaska and so on is a clear reality, because people want to save their souls. And the Arctic is probably the most ideal place in the world where they can risk-free save their souls.